Annie, if you would speak to farm subsidies in Kansas, is this a benefit to the, or someone, if anyone wants to touch on this topic?
Ken, Bob?
I'll go after you after
Pass.
you commit suicide.
Yeah, after I faceplant on farm subsidies. So the question is, I'm sorry, repeat. Sorry, I was shocked. Farm subsidies is.
Are they a benefit to the economy? Are they a drain?
You know, I really would let Ken or Bob tackle this one. What I would say in terms of farmers, I think an interesting point. I'll pivot and not answer your question. When we talk about those 330,000 small businesses, what's interesting is that there were about 50,000 farmers that we forgot to count when we first estimated the impact of this tax policy. So when we first passed this tax policy, it was supposed to be 180,000 small businesses, and we completely overlooked, as an ag state, 50,000 farmers, which is sort of remarkable to me. But be that as it may, those 50,000 farmers who no longer pay income tax are seeing other taxes go up, sales tax and property taxes. So when we just sort of talk about the overall tax burden on small businesses, on farmers in Kansas, it's actually shifted quite dramatically as a result of this income tax loophole. I'll let somebody else answer your actual question.
Okay,
That
so
was a good non-answer.
all right, so I'm probably going to commit suicide by this answer. But in any event, look, from a national perspective, I'm not a fan of subsidies. All right, any industry, whether it's farm or pick your industry, I'm not a fan of them. All right, and so in an ideal world, I'd like to see us get down there and get to zero. Now, it turns out the rest of the world is subsidizing agriculture, the most important of which, of course, is Europe. All right, so here's an area for trade deals. All right, and you know, we were negotiating a deal with the Europeans until this presidential campaign season has basically put the kibosh on trade agreements, and part of that deal is to get them to reduce their subsidies so we can reduce ours. So I think that's a good thing, all right, and hopefully the next president will be able to pursue that. But one thing I can tell you is that if the next president comes in and starts a trade war, this state will be screwed. All right? This state relies on exports hugely. We export planes, and we export wheat, and we export, you know, cattle. We export all kinds of things that are grown in this state. And the last thing this state should want is a president who's going to trigger a trade war.
Well, this one's for you then. If you would, Ken, describe inflation and why it is important to the economy, who determines the right amount, and how do they do it?
Inflation?
Yes.
Oh boy.
Should we get you another beer?
Yeah, I would really need 2 or 3 for that one. Okay, so the first part of the question was?
Just for anyone who isn't aware of it, if you would describe really what inflation is and why we need it. And
inflation is defined as a sustained rise in the price of all goods and services. So immediately you have a measurement issue, as it's very difficult to measure inflation. In fact, there are several competing measures of inflation, which, depending upon which one you believe, is, you know, anywhere from 0 to 2% roundabouts right now, depending upon the Federal Reserve prefers one called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Deflator, which I think is running around 1.5%. I think the CPI, the headline number now is under 1%. If you take out food and energy has been actually a drag on inflation. So it's actually a little bit higher. It's closer to 2%. I would say, and Bob can jump in and tell me if I'm totally wrong, but my understanding of the macroeconomic literature is that there is no absolutely right level of inflation. And in some ways you want to balance inflation with economic growth and other things. Now, who determines it was part of it? Nobody determines it. We try and measure it. We try and use it as a guide for our policy, either either loosely or tightly. Some people argue for a tight definition of inflation as well as a tight kind of prescriptive application of monetary rules in order to try and target a specific inflation level. Other people say you should look at it as a whole and look at what the economy is doing and use it to generally guide your monetary policy. But one of the things that I think is somewhat, I guess, interesting or is what it suggests about the current state of inflation suggests about how we should be spending, saving, investing. And one of the things that the rate of inflation is naturally tied to the borrowing cost, to the interest rate that we all have to pay on loans, including governments. And so we're borrowing a lot at all levels of government and most of us individually and in businesses, but we're borrowing at a lot lower rate. And that's exactly the type of incentives that the Federal Reserve is trying to get to when they are driving their rates lower and trying to do quantitative easing, et cetera. I'm boring people, I know. But the point is, when you see reports of inflation, what you should always, I think, kind of keep into the back of your mind is that it's overall prices. It's all the prices of all goods and services. It always strikes me when I see a report about this, people say, well, it's not being measured right because the price of X is going up. Even if the price of X is going up, it doesn't mean there's inflation. It has to be reflected in the price of all goods and services. So right now, there's almost no inflation throughout the economy. In certain goods and services, prices are going up, but there's very little inflation at all right now. And so it's a good time to borrow if you have to borrow. Not a great time to save if you have to save.
I could add something, but I'd be more than happy to have, I mean, we can go directly to the audience. I mean, I can add just two bugaboos that I've got about this subject if people want to hear them, but otherwise I'm happy to go to questions. I mean, you want me to talk or not? Okay, all right. So, since the recession, I don't know how many times people have probably been telling you, these are people called inflation hawks, especially at the Fed. They said, the Fed was creating all this money through quantitative easing, and now they've got a balance sheet of like $4 trillion, and it's going to cause tremendous inflation. Those people have been wrong for 6 years, all right? I mean, it makes me angry, all right? The Fed was trying to stimulate the economy, not that effectively, because people have lost a lot of confidence, but it was doing that because we had an austerity policy practiced by the federal government, all right? But we had no fiscal policy, so the Fed was trying to push on monetary policy, and hawks were saying, oh, it's going to cause inflation, and it didn't. And the reason it didn't is that the economy was basically not fully employed. And so wages weren't going up, so prices aren't going up, right? That's point one. Point two. When you're at the Fed, I analogize this to the following problem. Imagine you're driving a car, and you turn the steering wheel, but the car doesn't respond for 20 seconds, and you've got mud on the windshield. That's the way the Fed controls the economy, or tries, right? It's got mud because you've got all these conflicting data that get constantly revised. So you don't really know how well the economy is performing until later. And secondly, there's what's called the monetary lag. As soon as you change monetary policy, it typically has a 6 to 9 to 12-month lag. It's called a long and variable lag between the time of action and the time of influence the economy. So that means that people at the Fed have to predict where's the economy going to be in 12 months when I turn the wheel now. And what Janet Yellen has just done is after 9 years, 10 years, she finally turned the wheel a little bit and raised interest rates by 1/4 of a point, all right? And that's all she's done, all right? And I think the Fed will gradually try to increase interest rates, but they won't do it too fast because the economy's pretty shaky. But here's the important point. Rates are gradually, short-term rates are going to gradually go up over the next 4 or 5 years. That's inexorable. So if the government were to sometimes magically have what's called a fiscal stimulus now, whether through a tax cut or an infrastructure spending program or whatever, we would have, on the one hand, pushing on the accelerator all this extra money that we're spending on through a tax cut or infrastructure. On the other hand, we'd be pushing on the brake through monetary policy and slowing us down. So at the end of the day, those candidates can talk about stimulating the economy all they want, but the Fed is gradually going to be tightening. And so the net effect on jobs is not going to be that much, all right? And the irony is, and this is why I find it, and I don't want to sound partisan, but this is true for the Democrats who want to spend a ton of money, and it's true for the Republicans who want to basically have massive tax cuts. The Republicans were calling for 6 years for the Fed to tighten monetary policy, all right? So they were the ones criticizing the Fed. So now that the Fed is raising interest rates, all of a sudden they want tax cuts, and the tax cuts are going to be defeated by the higher interest rates that they've been calling for 6 years. All right? And then they have the chutzpah to go out there and say they're going to go out and generate all these jobs. It's not going to happen. All right? And by the same token, Democrats who were basically going out there and saying we're going to spend all this money and have all these extra jobs are not going to get them because the Fed's going to be gradually tightening. Now, I anticipate Bernie Sanders coming back and saying, well, I'll appoint people to the Fed who will basically step on the gas and print more money. All right? But I can tell you, A, those people probably will not be confirmed by Congress. And B, if they are, we are rapidly approaching full employment in this economy. And we are approaching the time when inflation will accelerate. So even though Ken's numbers are right, at some point those numbers are going to go up, and the Fed is trying to stop that by very gradually raising interest rates. So those are my two bugaboos. I'll quit.
Thank you. And then if any of you wants to get out your crystal ball, what is in the future for oil prices, and what, if anything, might other energy sources have to do with it? Anyone want to take that one on?
If I could predict the price of oil, I wouldn't be here. And I wouldn't be drinking a beer.
On. Yeah. Are there broader issues that we should be aware of that impact the economy that we haven't been discussing yet? Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, in a perfect world, if I could be king for a day, I would have a gradual, carbon tax, and yes, because it's fundamental economics that the cost of pollution, I obviously upset somebody, the cost of pollution is not fully taken account of in the production of goods and services. And the only way to do that is to put a carbon tax. And the virtue of a carbon tax is not only will it raise money, all right, and help close the deficit, but it will provide a market-like incentive to produce alternative fuels. That's good. So we should have had that. And by the way, if for people that are all obsessed about taxes, if you worry about that, I would be willing to accept a trade where you'd have a higher carbon tax and then lower the Social Security tax, so that basically we're not taxing labor, which is a good thing. I mean, let's not tax labor, but let's tax bad things like pollution. And so we could have a revenue neutral plan. A lot of people have talked about this, all right? It's not happening, and it's common sense, all right? But as you say, as we see, common sense doesn't necessarily prevail in Washington or on the campaign trail.
I think Bob is exactly right. I think a carbon tax is a good idea. I think there are things in the local area that can be done too to help out. So does anybody know what the biggest single source of carbon dioxide type emissions, global warming gases is? Where it comes from? Landfills, methane from landfills. Right now, there are communities out there, and we're working with some of them to try and get them financing so they can do methane conversion projects in order to be able to generate renewable natural gas and sell it into the pipeline. Now, unfortunately, the natural gas market has crashed, so it isn't as profitable. But it's one of those things where we're literally giving things away because it's a project which can work on an economic sense for individual jurisdictions and actually help them with their own budget deficits, while at the same time helping out the economy from converting harmful methane gas emissions into renewable natural gas, which can be sold into the system. And so I think it's things like that, too, which we should be thinking about, and that goes along the lines of, let's think of a tax credit policy, and there are tax credit policies at the federal level to help this, but what about some state policies to help this type of thing? And by the way, a lot of these companies that are doing this, are working with the local governments, are small businesses. So that's, I think, another promising area that we don't hear about all the time. We talk about big, grand schemes. Sometimes it's the smallest type of things that make the biggest difference.
I just want to say one more thing about the environment, because people did mention this. And I hate to pick on Trump, but I got to, because he's probably going to get the nomination, all right? You know, in the last debate, he was asked, and Chris Wallace really took him to the cleaners, by the way, when he was talking about a $10 trillion tax cut, and then Trump would say, well, and then he asked him, how are you going to pay for it? And then Chris Wallace showed him basically that what Trump was saying was basically going to add up to bupkis, all right? It wasn't going to come close to paying for $10 trillion in tax cuts. But one of the agencies he wanted to eliminate has an $8 billion budget, all right, compared to $10 trillion of tax cut. What was that agency that he wanted to eliminate? The EPA. All right. Now, look, I'm not a fan of all EPA regulations. All right. I could think of things where you can make things more efficient. You're talking about eliminating the EPA? Are you crazy? You know, I mean, this is unbelievable. Yes, he's saying he's crazy. All right. But I mean, this to me, I mean, is, you know, your jaws drop when you hear this. Or as long as we're talking about jaw dropping, let's just not restrict it to Trump. Kriz talks about eliminating the IRS. All right. And yet he's talking about a 10% postcard tax, whatever. And, you know, and somebody asked him, well, who's going to enforce that? All right. He says, oh, this little office in Treasury. You know how many taxpayers there are?
One guy sorting through the postcards.
Yeah. You know how many taxpayers there are in America? I'm not counting corporations now. There are 140 or 50 million people who pay taxes. And you're talking about 2 or 3 people in the Treasury Department who are going to enforce this? There are 100,000 people who work for the IRS. All right? Now, I'm not saying you want to need all of them or whatever, but the idea you're going to eliminate the IRS, this is fantasy talk. This is crazy talk. All right? I mean, I'm sorry I'm so exercised, but I've watched enough debates now. It's made me upset.
Bob, I feel like we should take the remote away from you at home and process some of this, because it's sort of at peak levels. I'm going to pivot back to something. And earlier, Bob mentioned winners and losers, and you might sort of catch on to my obsession with the Kansas tax policy. And in 2012 and 2013, we picked winners and losers with this tax plan, and we've continued to do that. I talked about the business, but when we talk about, you know, sort of what else is happening, this notion that we were going to leave more money in all of our pockets so that we would turn around and spend it by virtue of reducing individual income taxes, but at the same time, we've raised sales tax twice. We've done away with itemized deductions, which everyone is probably going to be realizing this tax season. Many of us are coming in for a huge surprise because we can no longer claim those things. In addition to where we first started were tax deductions and credits for low-income families. And no surprise, those weren't going to pay for the top 1% break. But we did away with a child-independent care credit. We did away with the refundable food sales tax credit, and Ken's done a lot of research on the food sales tax rate and its impact. We now have the highest food sales tax rate in the country. We used to have a refundable property tax credit for renters. We did away with that. So where we've left some money in the pockets of some Kansans, it has certainly been chewed up by increased sales tax, increased property taxes, new fees where there were once none. There was a hearing today or yesterday to increase the motor vehicle registration fee so that we can pay for more highway patrol. Should we have more highway patrols? Sure. We used to have money to pay for it. We don't anymore, so we're going to increase motor vehicle registration fees, which, by the way, is going to come out of your other pocket. Where the bulk of this break went to, as Bob alluded to earlier, not unlike the national economy, was to the very top. And that money, if you were to look at the breakdown of the tax policy changes between 2012, 13, and then tack on 15 to it, the top 1% saw a tax break of $25,000 back into their pocket. Now you say, well, of course, Andy, they make the most money. But here's the deal. That money's not coming back into our economy. Meanwhile, the rest of us don't have more to spend. In the long run, this game does not work. We are all seeing more come out of our other pocket while we're getting less from an income tax break.
And meanwhile, there are cuts for education and aid to local governments who then have to raise the property tax. So there's some other money coming out of your pocket. Plus businesses. A lot of businesses, they pay as much or sometimes more in property tax than they do in the income tax in the first place. So I know several businesses that didn't necessarily want any type of income tax relief. They would rather have it in the form of property tax relief or just maybe better services. So just to kind of pile on there, and I think this brings up something, and maybe the smarter people here can tell. I think it's this notion that we have to get away from symbolic politics. I mean, believe me, to a lot of people, dismantling the IRS sounds like a great campaign slogan, but it just won't work. It just doesn't do it. And there are examples, I think, on both sides of the aisle where we just have to be smarter about the policies we design and be more thoughtful about things. And I know I'm asking for unicorns here, but I think somebody has to step up and say, well, wait a second here, why are we doing this? I'll give you another example, sorry to monopolize, but at the county level, they've gone to a no debt policy, which, if you heard me interviewed on a local public radio station, which will remain nameless, I called shark repellent. It was you heard the numbers that I put out. There's no debt problem at the local. I mean, there's always a potential debt problem, but we're a lot farther away from it at the local level than we are at the state level. But nobody's talking about going to a zero debt policy at the state level. Instead, the state is piling on debt. And so these sloganeering campaigns, somebody's got to step up, like Chris Wallace and other people, I never thought I'd say that, and call people on it and say, you just aren't going to be able to do this.
So now this is for everyone. What can people in this room do locally to affect economic legislation in Wichita, Sedgwick County, Kansas, the nation?
Vote. Get out and vote and come to things like this. Go talk to your local elected officials. You'll see them all over the place. If you know who they are, you'll run into them at the YMCA. And they're there. They want to talk to you. They want to hear from you. They may not always do what you want them to do, but they're at least going to listen. And the more people they hear from, whether that's personally or by going to the polls, the more they're going to pay attention and potentially make changes or see other people take their place if they don't.